Salutations, dear viewers. This is George from Ireland, and in this video I'm talking about why it was wrong of the United States to move its embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. So far as I know, every other country in the world that has diplomatic relations with Israel situates its embassy in Tel Aviv, the largest city. Now, the State of Israel proclaims its capital to be Jerusalem. Palestine also claims that Jerusalem is its capital city. The modern State of Israel was created in 1848 by a United Nations resolution. Zionists often point to this to underline their claim that Israel is one of the most legitimate countries in the world, inasmuch it was created by the United Nations. However, it is therefore grossly hypocritical and illogical to then claim that Israel can disregard United Nations resolutions when it suits Israel to do so, despite Israel basing its legitimacy on the pronouncements of that very same organization. So you can't have it both ways. Make your mind up. Either the UN matters or it doesn't. Now, I know there were other reasons to found Israel, but these were not very convincing to Israel's neighbors. Anyway, so various US presidents had said that they would shift the US capital to Jerusalem. These have been campaign pledges, and they'd all backed out on that, presumably because they've been warned by the State Department and other government agencies that this would enrage the Arab and Muslim world, as indeed it has. And the US has often posed as an honest broker between Israel and the Arab world. Now, there's absolutely no way that the United States is an honest broker. It is the armorer, and it is the banker of Israel. Israel, which does almost nothing for the United States. Israel didn't send troops to Korea, to Vietnam, to the Gulf War, to the Iraq War, or US missions in Somalia, Niger, Afghanistan, you name it. They've occasionally had airstrikes on Syria, but they haven't assisted the US on the ground. The US does very little trade with this small country, so the United States owes nothing to Israel. Israel owes a huge amount to the United States, which has given it diplomatic backing and financial support, intelligence assistance, and so on for decades, to get virtually nothing in return. There can be no partnership for peace when the United States is so grossly one-sided. The Arab world has recognized that the United States is the only country which can exert some pressure on Israel. Israel's very often contra mundum. Now, mustn't be too hard on Israel. Yes, it's true that some of its neighbors have far worse governments, and the Israeli government is the only guilty party in the region. There's a lot of whataboutery. Oh, you mustn't excoriate us. You're singling us out, and you're not lambasting other regimes which do much worse. And there is some merit in that argument. But anyway, the United States should not have shifted the capital to Jerusalem for some of the reasons adumbrated. It has inflamed Arab and Muslim opinion. It's made peace less likely. The United States is trying to ramp up pressure on Iran, has torn up the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, and this has played into Iran's hands because Iran is perhaps the foremost opponent of Israel in the region. Iran arming, funding, training Hezbollah in Lebanon, Syria, and so forth, and likewise helping the Palestinians. Incidentally, this split between Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims is often overplayed. Iran is about 90% Shia Muslim. Shia Islam is the state religion of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Palestinian community is over 90% Sunni Muslim. There are few Christians and very few Shias, and yet they still have the fulsome support of the Iranian government and people. So it's a mistake to imagine that all or even most Sunnis and Shias hate each other. Yes, there are some bigots within both religious denominations who dislike each other, but it's by no means most. Anyway, the new embassy has opened, and now it's true that President Trump vowed to shift the embassy to Jerusalem, and he has made good on that promise. And generally speaking, that is something to be admired. He's broken many electoral pledges, like to withdraw from Iraq, Afghanistan, and so forth, to help fund Medicare, Medicaid, to drain the swamp, to no longer have Wall Street dominance. You name it, it goes on. And this is one of the few ones he's chosen to honor, and that's possibly because he's in hock to the Zionist movement, like most American presidents. Now, there's nothing wrong with Zionists disseminating their opinions and trying to influence people, and indeed they are highly successful at doing that. It's only fair that anti-Zionists also be entitled to spread their message and try to convince people. And the United States, they get very little airtime and they get a very unfavourable press. So there have been furious protests in Israel and Palestine, especially near the border fence, the illegal border fence, which has stolen yet more Palestinian land. Now, sometimes these have not been protests, these have been riots, these have been attacks on the Israeli security forces, throwing stones and Molotov cocktails, and the Israeli Defense Force has fought back, and lots of people have been killed, at least 50 Palestinians. I'm not sure if any Israelis have. Now, I can't go into every particular incident. I don't know the details of all of them, and these are hotly contested. But it's likely that the Israeli Defense Force has used excessive force. But none of these protests, or indeed riots, would have occurred if the United States had not shifted the embassy like that. The US government was warned that it would infuriate the Palestinians, and indeed it has. It's an extremely provocative thing to do. And indeed, Israelis and Americans would respond in kind if someone did something so grossly offensive to them. The United Nations, remember, gave Jerusalem to Palestine and Israel as a joint city, a shared city. And by claiming it as solely and exclusively for Israel, the undivided city of Jerusalem, unwilling to share any of it with the Palestinians, this shows yet again the unreasonable and belligerent attitude of the Israeli government. Now, I'm not condemning the Israeli people as a whole, nor would I condemn any nation or faith as a whole. There are, of course, reasonable Israelis who are minded to go for peace, to make some considerable concessions, as indeed there are people on the Palestinian side. One thing I must note, which is in favour of Trump's move, is that Congress voted for this a few times. So he has those reasons. He's playing to a domestic audience. He's got himself really a 100-star rating from Zionists for doing this. But it's going to make it less likely that peace can be negotiated. And this is one of the key demands of the Palestinians, that's been taken off the table. If you're not going to give them that, what are you going to give them? Right of return? More land? Money? One of my ideas is, as Palestinians, even those who were kicked out in 1948, the living individuals, not their descendants, as they're not going to be allowed back to their ancestral homes, could they at least be given compensation? Whereas someone who's a tiny fraction Jewish, whose ancestors haven't lived there for 2 millennia, would be allowed to move to Israel, which is preposterous and indeed racist. I mean, I know each country can determine its own immigration policy, but someone who is born there to not be allowed to go back there, and someone with the flimsiest and most distant of claim to an ancestral link is allowed back there because of their supposed faith, that is preposterous and grossly unjust. Anyway, this is the reason there's an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I believe in a two-state solution coexist. Israel has a right to exist, and so does Palestine. And it's Palestine which has been effectively wiped off the map. And this is rubbing Palestine's nose in humiliation yet again. It's very difficult not to feel sympathy for people who've suffered so much. And I know they've often had an asinine leadership which has never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity, as one Palestinian statesman said. I hope that the reasonable Israelis will see sense and be able to share Jerusalem with their Palestinian neighbours.